I've been on the road for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things out there. But nothing ever shook me like what happened to me in the summer of 2016. I don't scare easy, and I'm not the kind of guy who jumps at shadows. But this still keeps me up at night sometimes. It started with a load out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. A simple drive and haul heading east to Indianapolis. I had a full tank, a cooler stocked with energy drinks, and a couple of sandwiches wrapped in foil. The route was straightforward. Take I-80 east, stop in Nebraska for fuel, push through Iowa, then swing south through Illinois before making my final drop in Indiana. Nothing out of the ordinary, just another run. I left Cheyenne in the early evening. The sky was still bright, but you could feel the sun starting to sink. That golden hour glow stretched across the open plains, turning everything orange and red. The highway stretched ahead of me, long and empty, the kind of road truckers dream about. No traffic, no construction, just endless pavement and the hum of the engine beneath me. I was making good time, cruising steady at 68, just under the limit to save fuel. The weather was perfect. No wind, no rain, just clear skies and a long stretch of road ahead. But somewhere past Sydney, Nebraska, things started feeling off. First, it was small things. I'd glance at my mirrors and think I saw another truck behind me. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint glow of headlights far off in the distance. I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. Long hours on the road will do that. But then, about an hour later, I noticed my GPS had frozen. Now, GPS units glitch all the time and I don't rely on them too much, but what was weird was my phone had lost signal too. No bars, no data, nothing. I was still on I-80, a major highway, not out in the middle of nowhere, so that didn't make any sense. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a bad stretch of coverage. It happens. I kept rolling, keeping an eye on my mirrors, but everything seemed normal again. Just the empty road, the occasional car or rig passing in the opposite direction, and the low rumble of my tires on the pavement. But then, around mile marker 345, I saw something that made my skin crawl. On the shoulder ahead, there was a wrecked truck. A semi just like mine, but completely destroyed. The cab was crumpled like a soda can, the trailer torn open like a gutted fish. Pieces of metal and debris littered the road, but there were no cops, no tow trucks, no flares, no sign of any kind of response. That was strange enough, but what really got me was the truck itself. It looked old, not just worn down, but aged, like it had been sitting there for decades. The paint was faded, the tires were cracked, and the rust covered everything. The windshield was shattered, and the seats inside were torn, the stuffing spilling out like old insulation. I slowed down as I passed, trying to get a better look. The DOT numbers on the side were barely legible, but what I could read didn't make sense. The company name, what was left of it, was something I didn't recognize, and the lettering was in a style I hadn't seen in years, like something out of the 80s. I kept rolling, my gut telling me not to stop. Something about that wreck gave me a bad feeling, like I was looking at something I wasn't supposed to see. A few miles later, I checked my mirrors again, and that's when my stomach dropped. There were headlights behind me. They were far back, maybe half a mile, but they were there. Two bright white lights, perfectly spaced, moving fast. Too fast. I watched them for a while, my hands tightening on the wheel. They were gaining on me, but something about them felt wrong. The way they moved, too smooth, too steady. Most trucks on the highway have a little bounce, a little wobble, especially at high speeds. But these lights were locked on, coming straight at me like they were on rails. I pushed the pedal down, picking up speed. The lights matched me. I went to 75. The lights stayed the same distance. I went to 80, still there. I tried to convince myself it was just another trucker pushing hard to make time, but my gut was screaming at me that something was wrong. I flipped my CB to channel 19 and keyed the mic, Anybody eastbound near mile marker 350? Got a fast mover coming up behind me. Silence. That was another bad sign. There should have been chatter. 80 is one of the busiest trucking routes in the country, and even in the dead of night you hear drivers talking. But my radio was dead quiet. I checked my mirrors again. The lights were closer. Too close. I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to stay calm. I'd been in bad situations before. Snowstorms, near misses with four-wheelers, even a couple of times where I thought I might get robbed at a truck stop. But this was different. I hit the Jake brake, dropping speed fast, hoping whoever was behind me would pass. They didn't. The lights stayed locked on, adjusting instantly to match my speed. That's when I knew I was in trouble. I floored it, my engine roaring as I pushed past 85, then 90. My trailer wobbled, the weight shifting as I fought to keep control. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked-out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. 1 second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert, swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust. The kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. I don't know why I went back. I had hiked those woods before, years ago, back when I was younger and didn't know better. It was the kind of place that stayed with you, though, the kind that crept into your bones long after you left. The thick forests, the endless silence, the way the trees pressed in, heavy and watchful. It wasn't a friendly place. I had told myself I wouldn't return, but time dulls things. The older I got, the more I convinced myself that I had overreacted, that I had imagined things. So when an old buddy mentioned the cabin was still standing, deep in the woods, barely used anymore, I found myself considering it. A week alone in the mountains, away from everything. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. It didn't sound so bad. The hike in was harder than I remembered. The trail had mostly disappeared, swallowed by the undergrowth, and I had to fight through brush and deadfall to make progress. The cabin sat nearly 20 miles from the nearest road, far enough that no one just stumbled upon it. I had packed light food, water, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, and my rifle. I didn't plan to hunt, but I wasn't stupid enough to come out here unarmed. The woods had predators, both the four-legged and two-legged kind. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already dipping low, turning the sky that deep orange that never lasts long enough. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered. Weathered logs, sagging roof, a small porch with a single chair. The lock on the door was rusted, but the key still fit. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and dust. The furniture was simple: an old table, a wooden chair, a narrow cot against the wall. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, blackened with years of use. A few shelves held ancient canned goods that I wouldn't be touching. It was exactly as I had left it, but as I stood there, taking it all in, that feeling crept back. The one I had forgotten, that heavy, watching silence. I shook it off. First night nerves, nothing more. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent the daylight hours hiking the nearby trails, collecting firewood, filtering water from the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The solitude felt good, peaceful even. At night, though, the feeling returned. That sense that something wasn't right started small. On the third morning, I noticed something odd. My gear had been moved. My rifle, which I always kept propped against the cot, was leaning against the wall by the door. My pack was half-zipped, though I knew I had closed it. I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been careless. Maybe I had moved things and forgotten. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I locked the door. The fourth night, I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak of wood. I lay still, barely breathing. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Another creak. The porch. I gripped my rifle, heart hammering. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, mountain lion, maybe a stray hunter. But no animal would step that carefully. The sound stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the clearing. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, leading up to the porch, were footprints. Barefoot, human. The tracks circled the cabin, moving toward the door, then back into the trees. I stared at them for a long time, my skin crawling. I wasn't alone out here. I considered leaving, but I had hiked nearly 20 miles to get here. Another day's walk just to reach my truck. I told myself it was nothing. A lost hiker, maybe, someone passing through. I would stay one more night. That evening, I built a fire outside, keeping my rifle close. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. I ate quickly, my eyes scanning the treeline. As the sky darkened, I locked the cabin door and braced a chair under the handle, just in case. I lay down, but I didn't sleep. Hours passed. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A soft shuffle of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, my fingers tight around the rifle. The footsteps moved to the window. A shadow passed over the thin curtain. My chest clenched. I forced myself to stay still, to wait. Then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, just testing. I raised the rifle, my pulse pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The rattling stopped. A long silence. Then soft footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag, my rifle slung over my shoulder. When I stepped outside, the forest was still. The air felt wrong, thick and heavy. The footprints were back, fresh. They led from the trees to the cabin. But this time, they didn't leave. I scanned the area, my stomach twisting. Whoever had been watching me was still out here. I didn't wait. I moved fast, taking the narrow trail toward my truck. Every few minutes, I glanced over my shoulder. By midday, I was making good time. The sun was high, and I started to feel the first real relief in days. Then I saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, something was hanging from a tree. A deer carcass, but not just hanging. It had been tied there, its legs bound with vines, its throat slit clean. And beneath it, on the ground, a single object. A boot. An old, rotting hiking boot. I turned and walked faster. The rest of the hike was a blur, pushing through the underbrush, barely stopping to rest. By the time I reached my truck, the sky was turning orange. I threw my pack in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. But before I started the engine, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A figure stood at the tree line, far enough to be blurry, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. Small, barefoot, watching. I didn't wait. I turned the key, slammed the truck into gear, and tore down the dirt road, not stopping, not looking back. I never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what I saw in those woods. I just know that I won't be going back. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few 100 miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's going to go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark, the soft hum of the engine the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead, red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured, not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty, the only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help, and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the road still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead something moved, a shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped, not when my legs burned, not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose, until I saw my truck in the distance, until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. Hiking alone has always been my way of clearing my head. There's something about being deep in the woods, away from traffic, people, and phone signals that makes me feel like I can breathe again. This time, I picked a trail I had never hiked before. It was deep in the mountains, far from any major towns. I had found it through an old hiking forum, in a post buried under years of newer discussions. The guy who had written about it described it as untouched and hidden, a path only known to a few experienced hikers. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, just the essentials for a long day hike. Water, protein bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and an extra jacket in case the weather changed. I also carried a map and compass. I wasn't one of those idiots who relied on their phone's GPS in the wilderness. I knew how to navigate. The drive to the trailhead was long and isolated. a winding dirt road that kicked up dust behind me. My car bounced over deep ruts, the suspension creaking under the strain. The further I went, the more overgrown the road became, branches scraping against the sides of my car. When I finally reached the trailhead, it was exactly as I expected. Nothing but a small break in the trees, barely noticeable. No signs.
No markers.
Just an opening in the dense forest. I parked, shut off the engine, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The silence was immediate. No distant hum of cars, no voices, nothing but the wind through the trees. I took a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and started walking. The first few miles were beautiful. The trail, though faint, was still visible, winding through towering pines and thick underbrush. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. I moved steadily, keeping track of my progress with my compass and map. Everything matched up. The terrain was tough but manageable, a steady incline leading me deeper into the wilderness. Then, around the 5-mile mark, I found something strange. A single hiking boot. It was just lying in the middle of the trail, partially covered by leaves. I stopped, staring at it. It wasn't shredded like an animal had gotten to it. The laces were still tied. It looked like someone had just stepped out of it and walked away. I looked around. Nothing but trees. Maybe someone lost it and kept going. Maybe it had been here for months, left behind by some careless hiker. Still, something about it made me uneasy. I stepped over it and kept moving. The path that shouldn't be there an hour later, I reached a fork in the trail. That wasn't supposed to be there. I pulled out my map again. According to everything I had researched, this was a single trail hike. No intersections, no alternate routes. But here it was. One path veered right, continuing the gradual incline I had been following. The other sloped downward, disappearing into thicker trees. I hesitated that I should have turned back then, but I didn't. Instead, I took the downward path. It just didn't make sense. How had so many hikers missed this? The forum post had been detailed step-by-step directions, landmarks to watch for. There had been no mention of a split in the trail. Maybe they had just overlooked it. Maybe it was a shortcut. I kept going. The cabin, the deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The birdsong faded. The wind stopped. Even my footsteps sounded muffled, like the earth itself was absorbing the noise. Then, through the trees, I saw something that stopped me cold. A cabin. It sat in a small clearing, old and weathered, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The wood was gray with age, the roof sagging slightly. There were no windows, just a single door that hung slightly ajar. I didn't move. There was no reason for a cabin to be here. This wasn't private land. There were no old logging roads nearby, no hunting trails. I should have turned around, but something pulled me forward. I stepped closer, my boots crunching over dead leaves. The door creaked as the wind pushed it open just a little more. Inside, it was dark. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed the beam inside. Empty.
No furniture. No trash.
Nothing but a wooden floor covered in dirt and dead leaves. But something was wrong. The floor wasn't flat. There were grooves in the wood, deep scratches, like something had been dragged across it over and over again. I took a step back. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinct. Something rotting. I turned and walked away fast. I didn't run. Not yet. But my pace quickened, my breath tight in my chest. The wrong way out, I followed the path back the way I had come. At least I thought I did. After 20 minutes, I realized I wasn't going uphill. I was still descending. I stopped, turning in a slow circle. The trees looked the same in every direction, dense and unmarked. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly before settling in the wrong direction. I checked my map, but the landmarks didn't match. I should have been heading north, back toward my car. But somehow I was still going south. That's when I heard it. A branch snapping. Not a small twig, something thick, something heavy. Something walking. I turned, my heart hammering. Nothing. Just trees. But I wasn't alone. I picked a direction and moved fast. The figure in the trees, I walked for what felt like hours. My legs burned. My throat was dry. My water supply running low. Then I saw it. Not my car. Not the trailhead. The cabin. I had walked in a giant circle. My stomach turned. This wasn't possible. I had been going in a straight line. Hadn't I? Something moved in the trees. I snapped my head toward it, but it was gone before I could focus. But I had seen it. A figure. Not an animal. Not a hiker. Something else. Watching me. I ran. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just needed to get away. Branches whipped against my face, my pack thudding against my back. My breath came in ragged gasps, then a break in the trees. The road. I stumbled out onto the dirt, nearly collapsing as I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, spinning out as I sped down the winding road, not stopping, not slowing, not looking back. The final realization, I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station miles away. I got out, leaning against the car, trying to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something stuck to my boot. Piece of paper. I picked it up, my fingers trembling. It was old, yellowed, torn from something larger. One word was written on it in shaky, uneven letters. Run. I never went back. I had been driving long enough to know when something didn't feel right. I was running a long-haul trip from Illinois down to Arizona, hauling a load of construction materials, mostly rebar and steel beams, heavy but secure. It was a trip I'd done before, mostly interstate, no major mountain passes or tricky back roads. Just a lot of straight, open highway and long stretches of nothing in between. It was late September, the weather still decent but starting to cool off, especially at night. I had planned to make it down to a truck stop outside Oklahoma City before shutting down for a few hours, but I was running ahead of schedule. The road had been clear, and traffic was light, so I figured I'd push a little farther before stopping. I had been on the road for close to 11 hours already, only stopping for fuel once. I wasn't exhausted yet, but I could feel the weight of the drive settling in. My back ached, my legs felt stiff, and my eyes burned from staring at the road for too long. The sun had set about an hour ago, and the stretch of I-40 I was on was quiet, just the occasional set of headlights in the distance, most of them other truckers running night shifts like me. The sky was clear, the stars bright, but out here, that only made the emptiness feel bigger. I kept the cab cool to stay alert. The low rumble of the engine, the only sound besides the tires humming against the asphalt. Then I saw something up ahead. At first, it was just a glow, taillights in the distance, dim and barely moving. As I got closer, I could make out the shape of a vehicle on the side of the road. A pickup, dark-colored, pulled onto the shoulder at a slight angle. Nothing unusual about that. People pull over all the time. Maybe a breakdown, maybe a flat tire. I slowed slightly as I passed, just enough to check if there was someone outside needing help. There was no one, just the truck sitting there, idling, taillights glowing red in the dark. The driver's side door was open. I kept moving. Something about it didn't sit right. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone step out of the darkness, maybe waving for help, maybe just standing there watching. But there was nothing. After a few more miles, I let it go. It wasn't my problem. If they needed help, they could call for it. I had learned a long time ago not to get involved with roadside situations unless it was a real emergency. But then, about 20 minutes later, I saw another truck. Same make, same model, same dark color, same open driver's side door. This one was farther off the road, barely visible in the darkness. No hazards on, no signs of movement, just sitting there like the first one. I felt my grip tighten on the wheel. Something wasn't right. I kept my speed steady, forcing myself not to check my mirrors as I passed. My brain was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but nothing made sense. Two identical trucks, both abandoned in the middle of nowhere? I exhaled slowly, pushing the tension out of my shoulders. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a weird coincidence. Then I saw a third one. This time it was parked in the median, facing the wrong way. And this time there was someone inside. I only caught a glimpse as I passed, but it was enough. A figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely illuminated by my headlights. Not moving, not looking at me, just sitting there still as a statue. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, my heart thudding in my chest. My breathing felt tight, my hands sweating against the wheel. I had seen some weird things out on the road, but nothing like this. My mind started running through the possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of police sting, though that didn't make sense. Maybe it was a setup, a bait trap for someone dumb enough to stop. Or maybe I shook my head. Didn't matter. I wasn't stopping. The miles passed, the road stretching ahead, dark and endless. I tried to focus, tried to let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then I saw the headlights. In my mirrors, far behind me, just two pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching as they gained on me. My stomach clenched as they got close enough for me to see. Pickup truck. Dark-colored. I swallowed hard, keeping my hands firm on the wheel. My mind was racing now, running through my options. If they tried to run me off the road, I was heavy enough that they wouldn't win that fight. But if they had guns, I forced the thought down. Stay calm. Stay smart. The truck pulled into the left lane, speeding up to match my pace. I didn't look over. Didn't give them any reason to think I was rattled. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they cut their lights, vanished into the dark. My pulse pounded in my ears. I could still feel them there, somewhere, running beside me in the blackness. I kept going. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing. Then, ahead of me, I saw it. Another pickup, parked across both lanes. I hit the brakes, my tires screaming against the pavement, my trailer groaning from the sudden force. I felt my rig shudder, but I kept control, easing onto the shoulder as I came to a full stop. My lights washed over the truck blocking the road. It was empty. The driver's door was open, and behind me, I heard the sound of tires on gravel. I didn't hesitate. I threw the truck into reverse, slamming the pedal down. My trailer swung slightly as I backed up, my heart racing. Then, just before I hit the ditch, I cut the wheel hard and gunned it. The truck roared forward, my trailer fishtailing slightly as I tore back onto the highway. In my mirrors, I saw movement. Figures spilling out from the darkness, scrambling toward the abandoned truck. I didn't stop to see who they were. I just kept driving. I made it to the next town in record time, pulling into a well-lit gas station, my hands still shaking as I shut off the engine. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. No cops, no reports, nothing on the news, just another quiet night in the middle of nowhere. But I knew better. I never took that route again. I was running a long haul from Montana down to Texas, a good-paying load of steel beams headed for a construction site outside of Dallas. The trip was mostly open highway, cutting through Wyoming, Colorado, and into New Mexico before hitting the long stretch of Texas roads. I had done this route before, knew most of the truck stops along the way, knew which places had the best fuel prices, which rest areas were decent, and which ones to avoid. It was a straight run, nothing complicated. The truck was handling well, my trailer was balanced, and the weight was sitting right on the axles. My only concern was making good time so I could get ahead of a storm system I had been hearing about on the radio. Big rain coming out of the northwest, moving fast, threatening to dump water all the way down into New Mexico. I didn't want to be stuck hauling heavy steel on wet roads, so I planned to push through as far as I could before stopping for the night. I had left early that morning, fueled up outside of Billings, and made it past Cheyenne before sunset. The air was cooling down, the roads mostly empty except for a few other truckers running their own routes. It was one of those stretches of highway where you could drive for hours without seeing much of anything. Just road, dry grass, and the occasional gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated in 30 years. Around 9 at night, I passed a small roadside motel with a diner attached to it. I thought about stopping, maybe grabbing a coffee, but I wasn't tired yet. I figured I'd keep going, maybe make it into Colorado before taking a break. I had plenty of fuel, my logbook was clean, and I was making good time. That was when I saw the first sign. It was one of those old-fashioned wooden signs, half-rotted, sitting just off the highway. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. My headlights caught the faded lettering as I rolled past. I didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of old rest stops along these highways, some maintained, some not. I had used them before when I needed a quick stretch, though I preferred truck stops with other rigs around. Safer that way. But 2 miles wasn't far, and I was starting to feel that ache in my back from sitting too long. I figured I'd pull in, stretch my legs, maybe use the bathroom if it was clean enough. A few minutes later, I saw the turnoff. A narrow road, barely wide enough for a big rig, leading off the highway into the darkness. The sign was old, rusted, barely standing, but the words were still visible. I signaled, eased onto the exit, and followed the road. The pavement turned to gravel almost immediately. My tires crunched over the loose stone as I rolled forward, my headlights cutting through the darkness. There were no lights, no other vehicles, just trees on either side closing in tight. I slowed down. The place should have had at least some lighting. Even the worst rest stops usually had a few old street lamps, maybe a vending machine glowing in the dark. But this place was dead quiet. I kept going. Then I saw it. A small parking lot, cracked pavement, weeds pushing up through the cracks. An old brick building sat at the far end, the kind of structure that might have been nice 40 years ago but had been left to rot. A few picnic tables sat off to the side, their wood warped and splintered.
No lights.
No cars. I pulled into the lot, letting my rig roll to a stop. I kept the engine running. Something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it the second I stopped moving. The way the air felt too still, the way the trees seemed to press in closer than they should. I glanced around, checking my mirrors. Nothing. Just empty space, darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I was about to put the truck back in gear, forget about stretching, and get back on the highway. Then I noticed something. The bathroom door was open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough to see the dark space inside. It hadn't been open when I pulled in. I stared at it for a second, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe it had been open the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I had a feeling, deep in my gut, that I wasn't alone. I put my truck in gear. That was when I saw the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the gravel. But they were there, leading from the bathroom to where I had stopped. Not away, toward. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas, my tires kicking up dust as I swung the rig around and aimed for the road. The gravel slid under my tires, the trailer rocking slightly as I forced the truck back onto the exit ramp. I checked my mirrors one last time. The bathroom door was closed. I never saw it move. I never stopped at a rest stop like that again. I was hauling a load of lumber out of Oregon, headed for a distribution yard in Nebraska. It was supposed to be a straightforward trip, just interstate driving, a couple of planned fuel stops, and maybe a quick nap at a rest area if I needed it. I had been driving long haul for over a decade by then, so nothing about this trip felt unusual. I left the yard around noon, got through the mountain roads without issue, and hit the open highways by early evening. The truck was running smooth, my load was sitting right, and I had a good stretch of road ahead of me. I figured I'd push through until at least midnight before pulling over for some rest. The first part of the drive was peaceful. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the road, but the skies were clear. Traffic was light, just a few other truckers rolling along, the occasional car passing by. I had the radio on low, sipping from a cup of coffee I had grabbed at my last stop. I was somewhere in Idaho when I saw the car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road, barely visible in the fading light. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about it seemed off. It wasn't just broken down. It looked abandoned. The hood was up, but there were no hazard lights, no signs of movement. I glanced at it as I passed. The driver's side door was open. No one was inside. I kept driving. Things like that happen all the time. Someone breaks down. Maybe they walk to get help. Maybe they get picked up by another driver. But something about it unsettled me. About 20 miles later, I saw another one. Same make, same model, same open door. That was when my gut started telling me something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I had driven all over the country, seen my fair share of weird things, but two abandoned cars, same type, same situation, just miles apart? That didn't sit right. I kept my speed steady, watching my mirrors, scanning the road ahead. Maybe it was some kind of coincidence, or maybe there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. Then I saw the third one. This time it was in the middle of the highway. I hit the brakes hard, my tires screeching against the pavement. My trailer groaned under the sudden stop, the weight shifting behind me, but I kept control. The car sat there, no lights, no movement. My headlights washed over it, and that's when I noticed something else. The windshield was covered in something dark. Thick streaks like someone had smeared mud or grease across the glass. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wasn't about to get out and check. I eased my truck to the shoulder, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The desert stretched out on either side, nothing but open land, but something about it felt wrong. Like I wasn't alone. I took a breath, shifted into reverse, and started backing up. My trailer swung slightly as I maneuvered, my eyes flicking between my mirrors and the road ahead. Once I had enough space, I cut the wheel hard and pulled back onto the highway, rolling past the abandoned car as I picked up speed. I didn't look inside, didn't want to know. The road ahead was empty. The road behind me stayed dark. I kept driving. Maybe an hour passed. I had put enough distance between me and that stretch of highway that I started to feel a little better. The night air had cooled, my rig was running smooth, and I was getting close to the state line. Then I saw the headlights. Far behind me, just two tiny pinpricks of light at first. But they were moving fast. Too fast. I kept my speed steady, watching in my mirrors as the lights gained on me. My pulse picked up, my hands tightening on the wheel. It was a car, dark-colored, same make, same model. I exhaled slow, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just some guy in a hurry, flying down the highway. But I knew better. The car got closer, close enough that I could see it was the same as the ones I had passed earlier. Same shape, same dark paint, moving fast but staying just behind me. Then the headlights cut out, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I checked my mirrors. Nothing but darkness. I kept driving. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what was happening, didn't know what I had gotten myself into, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't stopping. Another hour passed. I kept my rig steady, rolling through the night, waiting for something else to happen. Then, Just as I started to think maybe I had outrun whatever this was, I saw the taillights, not far ahead, sitting in the middle of the road. A car, dark-colored, facing the wrong way. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I gritted my teeth, checked my mirrors one last time, and kept going. The car loomed closer, my headlights hitting it full force. The driver's side door was open, and this time there was someone standing next to it. A figure, just a dark shape in the glow of my high beams. I didn't see a face, didn't want to. I hit the gas. My truck roared past, my trailer rocking slightly from the air pressure, and then the car was behind me, swallowed up by the night. I didn't stop until I hit the next truck stop, a well-lit place with plenty of other rigs parked around. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, breathing hard. Nothing on the news. No reports of abandoned cars. Just another quiet night on the highway. But I never took that route again.